I think now I can present our first speaker of the day, and he's been already introduced, Dr. Cameron Petrie, the principal investigator of the MAHSA projects and the reader in South Asian and Iranian archaeology at the McDonald Institute. He's going to talk to us about the Survey of India historical maps, the history behind this map series, and with a few case studies, he will present a range of information we can understand and identify from these maps, as well as the challenges and opportunities. Over to you, Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azadeh. Let's just make sure I get this right. I'm just going to do this. Looks like we're sharing. Excellent.
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Thank you all very much. So I just I'm starting off this presentation by actually showing you a historical map from the outset, and I'll be showing you many more maps as I progress, and as Azadeh pointed out, this talk is designed to be a bit of an introduction to the concept of historical maps and their use in archaeology more broadly. But what you can see on this particular map, this is a map from the very early part of the 20th century, and this is actually in many respects, a very beautiful object in and of itself. It's a map that was designed and executed as part of an imperial mapping strategy, but it documents a landscape in a very specific point in time. And interestingly enough, much of these landscapes are familiar in the modern world, but they also have undergone quite a dramatic amount of change in the last 100 years. But importantly, these maps contain, just from their nature and the nature of the methods that were being used when the original surveys were undertaken, they contain a lot of information that is interesting and relevant, either from an archaeological sense or from a heritage sense. And researchers working in different countries in South Asia over the last 50 or 60 years were aware that these maps contained information, but there'd never really been any systematic attempts to document that information. So a series of projects that was started in collaboration between the University of Cambridge and Banaras Hindu University in India, namely the Land, Water and Settlement and the Two Rains projects, and most recently the Tigris project, have all set out some of the foundational work that we're now building on in the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project. And many people that have been involved in this work are actually in the virtual room. So I'm just saying a welcome and a hello and a thank you for all of your work and support, particularly my collaborative co-director, Professor R.N. Singh. I hope this will give a good explanation of the history of the work overall, but also a little bit of an outline of the type of work that we've been doing as well. So there's a considerable history of archaeological research that's designed around trying to reconstruct settlement landscapes and using the principles of landscape archaeology to try and understand how humans lived in particular landscapes, where they lived, and how those sort of dynamics changed over time. And this sort of work has been conducted in various regions around the world, especially in parts of the Middle East, Western Asia, parts of Iraq, Syria, the Levant, etc. There's also been quite extensive work done in the Americas, for example. And what has become clear from these sorts of approaches is that by looking at archaeological data as it appears on the ground, it is possible to reconstruct what people refer to as signature landscapes, so distinctive types of approaches that were used in the past to live in particular locations. And these can be revealed by looking at archaeological data systematically. Now, there's been various approaches that have been used to identify archaeological sites. And in many ways, archaeological survey and landscape analysis has benefited enormously from methods that make it possible to work remotely. And interestingly enough, these methods are also in some ways very well suited to a period where it's quite difficult to go and work on the ground. So most specifically in the last 20 years or so, has been a considerable amount of work making use of declassified Cold War satellite imagery, whether they be satellite photographs or aerial photographs and various sorts of other types of resources. And as you can see on the top left-hand side, due to the nature of the Cold War and the powers that were in play at that point in time, actually quite large parts of the planet are actually covered with reasonably systematic satellite imagery that was documented, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. Now, what's interesting about these images is that they often collected information on regional landscapes that are now lost, but due to factors like development or remodeling of the landscape, urban development, and various sorts of other aspects. But we have a vast range of material that has been used quite systematically in archaeological explorations in various regions. Now, what's interesting about working in a region like South Asia is that we do have extensive evidence for important archaeological heritage and archaeological history, particularly in the region of the Indus River Basin, which spans across the regions of modern Pakistan and also India. Now, we know that this is one of these great old world civilizations, regions that were dominated by the developments of early cities and early complexity. It was broadly contemporaneous with what we know occurred in Mesopotamia and Egypt. And there was a sort of a rise of urbanism and ultimately a decline of urbanism, and then a sequence of subsequent changes that occurred. Now, what's interesting about the archaeology of the region, the Indus River Basin, is that we have a very specific type of settlement archaeology that is in play in this earliest phase of urbanism. We actually have a number of very large cities, but importantly, there's actually only 5 known settlements that are in excess of 30 or 40 hectares in size. So this is quite interesting in a sense, because it does suggest that urbanism was an important feature of the Indus civilization, but also that it was relatively uncommon in the sense that a very high proportion of the population continued to live in village settlements. So if we're going to understand this ancient phenomenon, we actually need to look at the cities, but we also need to look at the settlements that existed in between these cities, the types of landscapes and settlement hinterlands that existed. And in order to do that, researchers for many decades have been involved in trying to identify archaeological sites on the ground. And there's an abundance of archaeological surveys that have been carried out, a range of attempts to collate the archaeological evidence together. There's been a numerous instances of publications that have either published primary research or collated that primary research together into large gazetteers. And those gazetteers have resulted in maps that look very, very convincing, and they show the distribution of archaeological sites across large areas. However, work that we've started to conduct in the last 5 years, which is building on work that started earlier, has been able to demonstrate that our knowledge of the archaeological information is actually quite skewed, and it's a little bit specific, and it focuses on, perhaps inevitably, the areas that have been surveyed have led to the production of the most amount of information that we have on archaeological site distribution. So this suggests that there's probably a lot more information that's there to be learned, a lot more archaeological and heritage sites that are out there. And this has all sorts of implications for understanding archaeological aspects, but also aspects of heritage and preservation and documentation and monitoring of those sites as well. So what we did starting in 2008 was to conduct a series of reconnaissance visits and surveys to try and understand the nature of the distribution of these sites. But also in the background, we were trying to set out the right sorts of methods and discovering new approaches to enable us to identify sites in a systematic way, but also as quickly as possible. So the initial surveys that we carried out starting in 2008 led us to a series of realizations. Now I'm going to illustrate these realizations actually with giving you some hints in the background of showing you some examples of historical maps, so you can see the implications of what it is that we're actually showing. So a number of these gazetteers have been compiled in the last 20 or 30 years. And these gazetteers list the locations of archaeological sites. They also list the periods that archaeological sites were actually occupied in. Now, one of the things that we realized in 2008 was that when we went to try and visit sites at the locations that were listed in the gazetteers, most typically the sites were not in the same location as the location that was listed. In some examples, the locations were out by considerable margins. So this is one specific example of an archaeological site that's actually 11 kilometers away from the listed location. Now, this is interesting historically for what we can learn about why that has happened. But if you think about it, think about the implications of that discovery or the realization, we can actually see that unless we know accurately where the archaeological sites are, it's very difficult to monitor them as a heritage resource. But it's also extremely difficult to analyze those sites in relationship to the landscape contexts that they're sitting in. So it's only really when you actually get an accurate assessment of where a site is located in space that you can actually use that information for any particular means. Another realization that we made quite early on was that there were actually a relatively small number of sites that were located along the courses of modern rivers and channels. It seemed as though a substantial number of sites were actually located perhaps in association with older or ancient and now vanished river courses. But it was quite clear to us that there had been a significant change in the structure and the hydrology of the landscape. And that was quite telling as well. The third and the fourth major realizations were connected to something that I've already alluded to. One of the things that became very clear was when we started to map the location of the known archaeological sites, and then we mapped the extent of the specific surveys that had been undertaken. It became quite clear that the vast majority of sites that were known because they were in areas that had been surveyed. And we had relatively little information about areas that had not been surveyed. That may seem sort of, completely obvious in many ways, but in the end, perhaps our knowledge of archaeological information is an accumulation that's built up over time. And people have documented archaeological sites in all sorts of ways and means. And the phase of carrying out archaeological survey in some respects is actually one of the most recent periods of discovery and documentation. But it's important if we think about the fact that we learn a lot on the basis of where we look, but if we don't look in certain areas, we then really don't know what is going on in those areas. So in the end, if we build up arguments about the number of sites or their distribution, based on patches of information, we end up with only a patchy explanation of what it is that we're actually looking at. And that is in many ways a problem. And the final realization was very much the case is that it was recognized that although we discovered hundreds of sites and that we knew hundreds of archaeological sites, there were actually probably many hundreds, if not thousands of archaeological sites that were out there that had not actually been formally documented. It's almost inevitable that these archaeological sites are known by local populations, local farmers, local communities, but they're not in formal registers of archaeological heritage and listings. So this is a problem in many ways. And we were asking ourselves from the very, very beginning of our archaeological research, particularly in northwestern India, what are the steps that we need to go through to resolve these problems? Now, in part of that process, and this is something that led us to build up systematic methods of trying to resolve these problems, part of that came about from the fact that even before we conducted the surveys, we made copies of historical maps and took them with us into the field.
Oh, yeah.
Because we were aware that these historical maps were useful. And in some ways, we didn't quite know why these maps were useful and why they were significant. What we've done in hindsight actually is to retrospectively go and have a look at the history of mapping that has been carried out as part of the Survey of India in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, particularly, and therefore giving ourselves the opportunity to understand why these archaeological sites, heritage sites and features were being documented deliberately, as Azadeh pointed out, but also why they were being documented effectively accidentally. And that was not necessarily a part of the original plan of the survey that was taking place. But what we have actually as part of the Survey of India work, particularly the maps that were produced in the early part of the 20th century, were extremely high resolution illustrations that show us features on the ground. Often they are mounds. Often they're mounds that are no longer occupied, and they have distinctive shapes in the landscape. And basically, this is the outcome of this progressive move during the period of British control of South Asia, was to survey the landscape and to document it systematically. Now, the Survey of India set out in the 19th century, actually starting even earlier, to establish a trigonometric survey across South Asia. They attempted to document the landscape, to conduct analyses that enabled them to measure the heights of the Himalayas, for example. But they also engaged in surveys that there was assessing trigonometric aspects, measuring the curvature of the Earth, because the size of the subcontinent was so much larger than the British Isles. It actually made it possible to make mathematical calculations for the curvature of the Earth. But in addition to that type of, in many ways, scientific information, there was complementary surveys that were carried out that took analysis of the topography of the landscape. And these were also combined with revenue surveys, which were designed to make an assessment of the economic output of farming land and the landscapes. Now, these surveys were carried out over many, many decades, and they were inevitably carried out progressively, so small, one region at a time. So there are many maps that have been published that show the progress of these surveys over time. And so this map is an illustration of the progress of various surveys of different types. The topographic surveys on this illustration are shown in green, and the revenue surveys are in red and pink, showing the intensity of the survey and the work. And then what happened subsequently in the early part of the 20th century was that there was a specific move to actually publish the outcomes of these surveys. So we saw the combination of the topographic and the revenue survey information and the progressive, gradual publication of these map series over time. And the Survey of India published map sheets that show the progress of the surveys and the degree to which they were resolved at different points in time, in real time. Now, what was interesting about this program of survey was that there was actually a recognition as the publication work continued that there was all sorts of information that had actually been documented as part of the original surveys. So what you can see in this illustration is two different examples of surveys that were, legends that go with the survey maps. And you can see there's a considerable degree of focus on the type of infrastructure that political agents would have been interested in, where the railways are, where the roads are, where the springs are, where the forts, where the religious sites and monuments are, where the post office and telegraph offices are, boundaries, geographical locations, and those sorts of features. But in addition, many of these maps also documented information about the landscape that was sort of hidden in the background, the types of topographic features like riverbanks and the movement of river channels, the appearance of water tanks and whether or not they held water or did not. But importantly, as you can see in the rectangle shown in blue on the lower one of these legends, there's also the documentation of settlements. Now, what's interesting is that in addition to the documentation of settlements that were actually being occupied, these surveys also assessed whether or not settlements had walls.
Not yet, baby.
Whether they had
Cameron, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you. Sorry, I think the mute all button was pushed. Yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so whether the surveys were assessing whether or not settlements were occupied, whether they were deserted, and they also documented whether or not a site was a known ruin as well. And that was marked in a specific sort of Gothic script. Now, what's interesting, therefore, is that the surveyors themselves were actually recognizing unusual things on the ground. And they used specific symbols on the historical maps to document these unusual features. Now, what you can see on the lower right-hand side is the number of features that are visible on a relatively small area of one of these historical maps. The numbers relate to the feature type. So there's features of certain sizes and things. And the features that we've started to document systematically, starting as part of the Two Rains project, continuing through the Tigris project, and now as part of the MAHSA project, is to systematically document these different features. So some of these elevated features appear to be shown as stippling. Some of them are shown as an incomplete contour line, which is called a form line. And some of them are shown as with hatches. And we know from our knowledge of the archaeological history of the subcontinent is that people lived in mounds over an extended period. So lived in settlements, and these settlements gradually decayed and formed mounds and became elevated locations. The interesting thing on looking at these maps is that there's probably a vast number of features that are not actually archaeological sites that are occupying the same space as features that we recognize are archaeological sites. So how do we solve this problem? Or what do we do to use these historical maps? So we started in many ways by looking at some known features, some famous locations, to see how they were actually being depicted in these maps. So looking at the archaeological site of Harappa, for example, which is in the Punjab region in Pakistan, you can see this is an archaeological site that was known in the 19th century. It was actually documented by various people that visited this location, and by the time it was documented on a Survey of India map in the early part of the 20th century, it was already being referred to as the sites of the ancient cities of Harappa, which you can see here. If you look adjacent to the Gothic script name of the ancient cities of Harappa, you can actually see a sequence of form lines that show the outline of these archaeological mounds, which make up the main city, or the main ancient Bronze Age city of Harappa, which you can see located in the central part of this image. But if you also look further up to the northern part, there are also other features that lie outside of the city of Harappa, the ancient settlement of Harappa. And these are marked in the illustrations in the same way. They have dotted form lines around the outside, and they also have crosses to show that they represent abandoned villages, abandoned settlements. So even very, very close by to a known and very famous archaeological site, the surveyors were also documenting other features in the landscape. If we look today at a satellite image, you can see that what we can see in the early part of the 20th century was the mounds at Harappa and various settlements you can see close by. And that landscape is actually broadly similar, but it's also much more densely occupied. And this is a very, very common characteristic of landscape change, especially as a result of the dramatic population increases in the 20th century and the early 21st century. And if you look closely, you can probably see areas where the mounds actually sit, but many elements of the landscape that were visible in the early part of the 20th century are no longer visible in the satellite imagery, or at least no longer easily visible in the satellite imagery. So knowing this sort of information exists, there's been archaeological work that's been carried out as part of the Two Rains project, but also associated Murray Curie projects. Now, this is the work done by Arnau Garcia while he was largely while he was based here in Cambridge, where he set out to systematically document a very large area of the southern part of Punjab in Pakistan, and using these historical maps looking at the different sorts of features that were shown on the historical maps, which you can see on the lower left-hand side. We see the depictions of forts, which are referred to with the name of the fort written after the word Kut. And then you can see a sequence of specific symbols that show the forts themselves. You can also see adjacent to that, there's a ziyarat and other sorts of features that are visible. Adjacent to that, you can see images of abandoned settlements that are shown marked with crosses. You can also see features of other, on the lower left, you can see different sorts of religious structures surrounded by different features as well. And the lower of the four images on the lower left-hand side, the one on the right shows the name of a village, which includes the word Tibi, which suggests that there's also some sort of mound feature associated with it. Now, when put together systematically, Arnau has been able to ascertain that there was actually potentially many thousands of archaeological sites in what was a relatively small area of southern Pakistan. Now, and this is looking at all of the different types of mound features that we can actually identify from the maps. If we compare that data together with what we see from the archaeological settlements, or the known archaeological settlements, we see an abundance of matches between the known surveys and the features in the historical maps. But perhaps inevitably, there's many more features from the historical maps than what is known from the surveys. Now, just to give you an explanation of the type of work that we've also done in Northwest India, we've also done a lot more systematic analysis of these sorts of map features, but we've matched that together with surveys carried out on the ground. Now, this is the work that's been carried out in conjunction with Banaras Hindu University and has resulted in a number of publications. And it was very clear that the surveys in this particular part of Northwest in India had been very good at documenting heritage sites, both known and unknown heritage sites. So our work has been carried out over the past 13 or 14 years, conducting surveys in a variety of different areas. And we've tried to effectively systematically explore the landscape as best we can. And what's interesting to note in the work that we've carried out is that there is actually several instances of very famous archaeological sites that were documented in the very early part of the 20th century, but not rediscovered, in inverted commas, by archaeologists until much later on. Now, this is the map sheet that shows the location of the ancient city of Rakhigarhi, which is a very famous archaeological site. And you can see that documented on this map sheet were a number of mounds which correlate with the mounds that are now known of the archaeological site. And so we can see that even at this point in time, if archaeologists had known what to look for, they would have actually already been pointed in the right sort of direction in terms of features that could be documented. So what we've done, in addition to looking at sites like Rakhigarhi, we've also looked in the areas around Rakhigarhi. So this is a map showing the location of Rakhigarhi in the center. The green dots on this illustration show the location of the known archaeological sites before a systematic survey had been undertaken. The more solid dark lines that zigzag across this map delineate the boundaries between different administrative districts. And what you can see actually is that there's two districts on the right-hand side of this map that have been surveyed much more extensively than the areas on the left-hand side of this map. So already you can see that there's been an impact on where surveys have been undertaken and what we actually know about the archaeological evidence. We conducted a survey in 2009, and that survey resulted in a dramatic increase in our knowledge of the distribution of archaeological sites around Rakhigarhi. And this was a bit of a match-up between looking for archaeological sites using specific methods of village-to-village survey, but also connecting those site locations with what was visible on the historical maps as well. What became very clear was that there was actually important hinterlands of information about archaeological sites that could be understood and reconstructed. And here you can see the location of Rakhigarhi up in the very top right-hand side. And in the area to the southwest of Rakhigarhi, you can see a series of archaeological sites that are distributed. It looks like in a broad line, depending on how close you squint your eyes. But it gives you a bit of an idea that there's actually quite rich hinterlands around these urban sites that can be understood. So starting as part of the Two Rains project, we set out to systematically document, again, a very large area with all of these thousands and thousands of map features. And this shows you on the lower right-hand side where the Rakhigarhi area was, and an area to the north and to the west of Rakhigarhi, showing the vast regions that are actually documented with the historical maps. So this was work that was done in advance in the lab, using maps and using GIS methods to tag these maps and to understand them. And then once that information was gathered, it was then possible to conduct systematic on-the-ground archaeological surveys, and using a sequence of tools, digital tools that would enable us to document archaeological sites in a specific way, to document them using tools like mobile phones and tablet devices, and to record information about their location and record information about their periods of occupation. And this system that we've developed is very much thanks to the work of Dr. Adam Green, working with Dr. Aftab Alam and Amit Ranjan in the field especially, and a number of other collaborators who have been able to sort of systematically and quickly visit archaeological sites, identify the locations of those sites, and make assessments of the preservation of those sites. So this shows you what we can see using things like Google Earth. We inevitably have to do a lot of interaction and discussion with local populations to find out information about the archaeological sites of interest. We inevitably also encounter all sorts of different stages of preservation of these archaeological sites. Some of them are actually under active cultivation, as you can see on the top left and the top right. Some of these archaeological sites are quite badly damaged, but some of them are actually quite well preserved. And all of that sort of information can be documented. And what you can see on these images is that on the satellite images themselves that are often visible, it's possible to see a mound feature, but actually it's only really possible to get lots of information by assessing these archaeological sites on the ground and actually conducting detailed analysis and assessment. At the tail end of all of this, what we learn is a lot of information about archaeological site distribution. We document hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites, and they enable us to reconstruct landscapes and landscape change over time. So we can see, for example, where village settlements were distributed before the development of cities in northwestern India. We can look at what happens when urban settlements develop and where settlements were abandoned and settlements were concentrated in certain areas. And it's also possible to look at what happens after a city declines and where populations redistributed themselves into the landscape and the way that those settlement patterns exist. So hopefully you can see that by starting with a tool, a document that was created as part of an imperial mapping project, and that has continued on and is actually continuously being updated up to the present time, we actually have the opportunity to look at historical documents that are actually recording ancient settlement landscapes. And that creates an opportunity for us to get a really keen understanding of what the situation of preservation of these sites was around 100 years ago, which is very different to what the situation of preservation is for now. And so therefore we have a method and a mechanism for documenting lost archaeological heritage, but also potentially helping us look for archaeological heritage that is perhaps hidden in plain sight right before our very eyes. So just the last slide I'm going to show you is literally a thank you slide. To inevitably, this work is only possible with the collaboration and cooperation of large numbers of people, whether that be a large group such as what we're speaking, the type of group that we're speaking to now, lots of collaborators that are either working together in different countries, people bringing different knowledge and different technologies, and ultimately also people working together in collaborative teams on the ground. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Cameron, for this wonderful overview of the Survey of India historic maps and their use, kind of with the different examples that you were giving of the use of these maps. And now, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. We're going to have a short presentation now, and then we're going to have a joint Q&A session.